Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk today about the battle that's been going on for a little more than 6 months now between the El Mayo faction of CDS and Los Chapitos, the so-called CDS Civil War. We're going to look at it in a little bit of a different way. Before we get to that, though, I'm going to start doing some news updates every week. We did that last week, maybe the week before, and I thought it was a nice way to kind of start things off. So before we get into CDS, a couple of things I wanted to mention kind of from the news of the last week. One is a crackdown, or a seizure, I should say, from Baja California. So there was a set of search warrants that were executed in Playas de Rosarito. As a result of those searches, several arrests were made, and there was the seizure of 122 kilos of cocaine and 238 bags of methamphetamine. I mentioned this one in part because one of the things that I think we're going to see, and I have some evidence of that, and I mentioned this before, there's a reason why I can't say where this comes from for a couple more weeks, but I will. But there is evidence to suggest that as the cartels move away from fentanyl, with fentanyl being the primary focus of both the Mexican government and the U.S. government, that they're going to start moving back towards cocaine, number one, and number two, methamphetamine. The other thing with respect to cocaine is there is evidence to suggest that cocaine use in America is on a significant rise. So let's look in the future, and if we see more and more of these busts related to cocaine and or methamphetamine, that'll be interesting to see. Another thing that I think is worth noting is the Sheinbaum administration, as we've talked about, has done a variety of things that are significantly different than what AMLO did. And if you remember, about 6 years or so ago, the federal police force was essentially disbanded, and the security responsibilities were basically turned over to the military. Now, there is a lot of reports, shall we say, that under Sheinbaum, there is an effort to build what some have called an elite civilian investigative and special operations force. And the security chief for Mexico, Omar Garcia Harfuch, is the one who is putting this together. He is drawing personnel largely from the former ranks of the federal police. And it appears to be an effort to pull some of these security, some of these interdiction efforts with the cartels away from the military and back to a civilian force that's under the command of the security chief and, of course, the president. Allegedly, it is going to be known by the initials UNO. It's the National Operations Unit. It is said that at the present time, there hasn't been any real formal announcement about the formation of this National Operations Unit, or UNO, by its Spanish initials. but reports are that it's a kind of quote unquote open secret among the former members of the federal police. Last thing to note from last week is there were several raids that occurred in a couple of different jurisdictions through an operation called Operation Bastion. But what's really important is that 21 properties were seized that apparently belonged to the leaders of La Familia Michoacana. Now, remember, there's the old one and the new one, and they may be the same, so we'll avoid that. But let's say leaders of La Familia Michoacana, you have Jose Alfredo and Johnny Hurtado Olascuaga, El Fresa and El Paz. Their properties were taken. Apparently, these had architectural designs, luxury finishes, gold plating, precious wood, swimming pools, artificial lakes, tennis courts, irrigation systems, etc., etc. So it was a big bust in that regard, a big seizure. Nobody of significance was arrested during these raids, but it shows a couple of things. It shows the clout and the power of La Familia Michoacana, and the opulence that they have, and it reaffirms their position in certain areas in the nation of Mexico, right? And sometimes it's very easy for us to focus on the cartel names we know, CDS, CGNG, and others like that, and forget about the fact that there's lots of others, and there's lots of others who have, significant involvement in criminal enterprises, and we shouldn't forget about that. So that's the news for this week. Let's talk about this issue of the CDS Civil War. And I'm not sure I like that terminology now. I liked it at first. I'm not so sure it fits now, but I'll probably continue to use it for another week or so. I want to look at this in a different light, right? I've spent some time talking about the violence, particularly in Culiacan, the economic losses, the losses to school kids that aren't able to go to school or haven't been, all of these sorts of things. But I want to look at it in a slightly different direction today. Before we do that, though, let's go back and kind of remember how this all started. And God, it's amazing. July 25, 2024. That's coming up pretty darn. The 1 year anniversary is coming up fairly soon. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago. But July 25, 2024 was the day of the arrest of El Mayo and Joaquin Guzman in Texas. We've talked all about how the extradition kind of occurred and stuff. But the important thing is that's when they were arrested. And the key really is the arrest of El Mayo. Remember, almost immediately, the Mexican government said, we didn't have anything to do with it. We weren't involved. We weren't notified, etc. On August 9th, the then ambassador to Mexico from the United States, Ken Salazar, said that Zambada, El Mayo, had been forcibly taken to the U.S. against his will, and that when the plane landed in the United States, Guzman had surrendered voluntarily. That led to even more of the speculation that there was some type of a betrayal involved. That betrayal narrative took on even more life the next day, August 10th, when El Mayo had a letter go public through his attorney, Frank Perez, that said that he had been ambushed and kidnapped by Joaquin, and that Joaquin was the one who handed him over to U.S. authorities. The letter said that El Mayo had been invited to a meeting to negotiate and resolve disputes between two leaders of the political parties in Sinaloa, Governor Ruben Roca Moya and Hector Melesio Cohen Ojeda, leader of the Sinaloense party. Mayo said that when he arrived, and we've talked about this, remember he says that he saw some people that he knew, so he told his security force to kind of stay back. And because of the people involved, he didn't really bring a large security force. He walks in thinking that he's going to have this meeting, and he says he was attacked, bound, handcuffed, thrown into the back of a pickup truck, taken to a vehicle, or taken by a vehicle to an airstrip where he was forced onto a plane and flown to a airport in the United States, where he was then arrested. So all of that is up until August. Things really changed on September 9th. That's kind of the day that everybody points to as the beginning of the fight between the Mayiza, those that followed El Mayo, and the Los Chapitos. So this is September 9, 2024. One of the things that happened at that time was a Mexican army convoy encountered civilians in La Campiña, which is a neighborhood on the east side of Culiacan and said to be a stronghold of Los Chapitos. There was a shootout resulting in the death of one army member. Violence escalated rapidly throughout the day. Clashes throughout Culiacan that then moved into southern Culiacan, which was supposed to be the stronghold of La Mayiza. Neighboring municipalities were then affected. By midday, a group of gunmen briefly boarded a public bus, issued warnings to passengers and the driver about future violence. At that point in time, that's when schools were canceled, the university was canceled, businesses shut down, etc. And in the months that have followed, as we've talked about before, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of confrontations, numerous deaths, really a decimation of the Culiacan economy, and no real resolution up to this point. Okay. So that's kind of how we got to this point. Let's talk about CDS for a moment. In 2024, the DEA put out their National Drug Threat Assessment Report. It comes out once a year. I think we talked extensively about last year's report. But one of the things that report brought out was that, according to the DEA, as of May 2024, so before El Mayo's arrest, before any of the violence really started, the Sinaloa cartel did not have a centralized leadership, but it was more of an umbrella structure, right? And we all knew part of that, right? We knew that after El Chapo was arrested and extradited to the United States, that his kids, or at least 4 of them, formed Los Chapitos, and that they had some separate functions from El Mayo's group, right? So we knew there were at least 2 different groups within CDS, and we've talked in the past about what was the degree to which they cooperated with each other or didn't. Here's what the DEA said, though, that we may not have focused on as much. In addition to Los Chapitos and the group once led by El Mayo, there were two other groups that had, or let's call them two other factions with their own leaders that constituted part of this umbrella structure. Remember, this is from the DEA, May of 2024. So one faction was led by Ariano El Guano Guzman, El Chapo's brother. And there was a faction that had previously been headed by Rafael Caro Quintero, who, as you know, was in prison at that time, now has been extradited to the U.S. But there was another group that was a Caro Quintero group. That, of course, is separate and apart from the Caborca cartel that Caro Quintero and his family run or lead, or did run and lead. And it is uncertain the direct connection between the Caborca group and this faction within CDS led by, or formally headed by, Rafael Caro Quintero. So a few things have happened in the last few weeks that have led people to start speculating and thinking more about the exact events that occurred between Joaquin and El Mayo and the reasons for it. Right? There seems to be very little debate or little questioning that El Mayo was set up by Joaquin and was, forcibly taken into the United States, where he was then arrested. There are questions, though. How did that all work out? Or what's the reason for that? We've talked about this before, but I want to go back through it again for just a second. Theory number one is that Joaquin acted alone. Right? Remember, Joaquin is a full brother to Ovidio, and Ovidio had been captured in 2023 and was in the United States. Joaquin is a half-brother to Yvonne and Alfredo. Some have suggested that Joaquin acted alone. He made the plan to be able to get out of the business. His way of getting out of the business, and remember we talked once about he has a wife who wanted nothing to do with the drug business. The best way to do that is to do something favorable for the U.S. government, and getting El Mayo is, certainly fits that bill. And then he could negotiate the best deal he could, which then would allow him to be in the United States, allow his wife to come to the United States, and even if he had to serve some time, it wouldn't be in Supermax, et cetera, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two is the theory that it was a plan by Yvonne. And there's two ways that this can go. One is that Yvonne thought of this, and remember, we've got the conversations that El Mayo and El Chapo had with their kids at different times of saying, you know what, you might as well just get out of this business, give yourself up and make the best deal you can. So this theory says Yvonne decides that now is the time to take power from El Mayo. The best way to do that is to get rid of El Mayo. And the best way to do that is to use his half-brother, Joaquin, to lure El Mayo into a trap. There's speculation, and some reports suggest that Joaquin in the past had, of the four Los Chapitos, had the best connection or relationship in the past with El Mayo. And remember, at one point, these guys were all pretty close. So it was easier for Ivan to use Joaquin to set the trap for El Mayo. Was Joaquin in on it? So, we said maybe Joaquin acted alone because he wanted to get out. Well, maybe his brother knew that. And so between the two of them, they concocted this plan, which helped Ivan in his, idea of trying to take over greater control of CDS, and also got Joaquin out of the business. Here's the other one, though. The second component to this that wasn't widely discussed earlier is, what if El Mayo wasn't supposed to go alone? This theory says that El Mayo was supposed to take Mayito Flaco with him. Joaquin had specifically talked about things that involved Mayito Flaco and had suggested that in trying to resolve this dispute, between these political elements in the area, that it would be better, Joaquin said, if Mayito Flaco was there too. But, the theory goes, Mayito Flaco didn't want to go for whatever reason, so El Mayo went by himself with the limited guards, and as a result, he was taken away. But Mayito Flaco wasn't, and Mayito Flaco is still in charge of La Mayiza today. If this was a plan by Ivan, wouldn't it make a whole lot more sense? A whole lot more sense if Mayito Flaco was there too. If you could get both El Mayo and Mayito Flaco at the same time. Because if you're trying to take more power from La Mayiza, it helps to cut off one of the heads, but if you could get both of them, right? And remember, El Mayo was an old man in not very good health. You have to wonder on a day-to-day operational basis, how much was he doing? And if Mayito Flaco had taken over a lot of that day-to-day operational control, the value of getting both of them, that's one where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 + 1 = 5. All right, so think about that. Now, when the war started, so September 9 and in the immediate aftermath, it became exceedingly clear, I think, to most observers, that the fighting between Chapitos and La Mayiza was largely instigated by Mayito Flaco as revenge against Los Chapitos for El Mayo's arrest. And if you put yourself back, again, we don't have to go super far back. Go back to September of 2024. El Mayo's gone. We know Maito Flaco is there, but nobody really knows what his credibility is, what his power base is like, the degree to which he could just easily take over for his, for his father. There was a lot of question as to his power, his ability to maintain control of the networks and everything that his father had worked so long to have. And one of the things we now know is that Maito Flaco, according to Mexican military reports and reports from the DEA, it indicates that he is now firmly in control of the drug trafficking and money laundering operations of his father, and is, we'll call it, the unquestioned head of La Mayiza. That comes with burdens as well, right? Now that you're in power, there is going to be more attention to you, and Maito Flaco has been the subject of more investigations by the Mexican government in particular than he had before. But one thing that we've learned for sure is if there was any question about Maito Flaco's ability to rise to the occasion and take over for his father, those questions have long since been answered. Okay. Now let's look at some of the things that have happened in the last few months. We won't go into great detail on this because we spent a lot of time talking about it previously. But remember, on at least 2 occasions in the last 9 months, Ivan escaped capture by National Guard or military forces by the skin of his teeth. The heat on Los Chapitos has been insane. And remember, a couple weeks ago, we talked about all the people who've been captured, right? We talked about whether that meant CDS was going to fall or Los Chapitos were going to fall. But tons of very capable people within the organization for Los Chapitos who have been arrested by the Mexican military. Another thing that has come out in the last couple of weeks, and this is part of the reason I thought of doing this episode today, is all of a sudden Chapitos have another enemy. Right? Remember, there's CJNG out there. We'll talk about them in a minute. There's the government and the military out there. There's Mayiza out there. And all of a sudden now, Chapitos have another enemy. And those enemies are the followers of Chapo Isidros. Fausto Isidro Meza Flores, El Chapo Isidro, his a drug lord. His group is called Mazatlejos. He is probably the most powerful drug lord in Mexico that never gets talked about in the United States. We're going to do a lot more about him in a couple of weeks. Real quickly, for those of you who aren't super familiar with El Chapo Isidro, he was in the Beltran Leyva cartel. He was a right-hand man of Alfredo Beltran Leyva. February 4, 2025, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He began his criminal career in the 1990s. He worked for the Juarez cartel, directly working with Amado Carrillo Fuentes when Amado Carrillo Fuentes died during plastic surgery complications in 1997. He left the Juarez cartel and joined the Beltran-Leyva cartel. His group is based in the region of Guasave, Los Mochis in Mazatlan. Also is prominent in areas of Sinaloa and Nayarit. Responsible for smuggling large quantities of methamphetamine, heroin, marijuana, and cocaine. He is under federal indictment and federal arrest warrant in the United States since 2019. As with a lot of these drug cases, the warrant comes out of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. He also was said to be one of the pioneers of the manufacturing of fentanyl and those infamous little blue tablets. In December 2024, the Mexican government seized a ton of fentanyl in Sinaloa that was attributed to El Chapo Isidro. That obviously put him even more prominently on the list of priorities for the United States and Mexico. He is, or his group is said to operate openly in 13 of the 20 municipalities in Sinaloa. And he's also said to have influence in areas of Sonora, Baja California, and Baja California Sur and Durango. All right. What's important for this discussion is it is said most of this comes from unconfirmed sources and reports and things, but there is a great deal to suggest that Chapo Isidro's group is fighting Los Chapitos in various areas and has inflicted operational and territorial losses on Los Chapitos recently. So you have that issue. Also have the situation, remember a few months ago, let's put it back maybe December, January, where there was talk of a CJNG and Chapitos alliance. Remember, we talked about that, and some people were, painting Ivan as this master strategist, that he'd arranged Joaquin's betrayal of El Mayo, and then he was going to set up this alliance with CJNG, kind of become a co-head with El Mencho, with the hopes that at some point these two would, kind of align together or form one cartel that he would be at the head of. If that ever was the case, and I don't think it was, I think it's pretty clear that they might have had some wink, wink, nod, nod, go ahead and use this particular route, this trafficking route. But there was never a real alliance or a possibility of a real alliance between them. But to the extent there was discussions of that, and there are some anecdotal reports out there of real discussions with El Mencho, but there's no evidence to suggest that that is occurring today. No evidence to suggest that any movement that might have happened at the beginning of the fight between Chapitos and Mayiza has resulted in a firming up of a relationship between Chapitos and CJNG, or between Ivan and El Mencho. So if we sit back, we're 7 months into this fight. Can we ask ourselves who's winning at this point? And it seems to me that we've got two clear winners, one that's maybe staying even at this point, and two clear losers. Who are the clear winners? I think you have to say the government's one of the clear winners from this, in the sense of their efforts to combat the cartels. All right. We'll talk about the losers in Culiacan in a minute, but the government has made tremendous inroads, particularly against Los Chapitos in the last 6 months. Those actions appear to be having consequences. If we look at drugs going through to the United States, the evidence is clear that fentanyl production or fentanyl trafficking, movement of fentanyl from the United States or from Mexico into the United States has decreased over the last few months. I'll also explain this in more detail later when I'm able to, but there's considerable evidence that certain supply routes, certain trafficking routes have been disrupted, both because of what's happening at the border in the United States on the U.S. side, but also because of the arrests and the seizures that have affected Los Chapitos. The second winner has to be Mayiza Flaco. He now has a bigger target on his back, but he's unrivaled as the leader of Mayiza. At least at this point, at least from what we know. Any question about him, his ability to step up, those are gone. Who's kind of treading water? I think that's CJNG right now. For reasons not completely understood, it does seem that CJNG has been poking the proverbial bear and engaging in some raids on National Guard and other troop movements and operations. But by and large, it appears that CJNG has stayed out of the fight between Mayiza and Chapitos, and instead is waiting to see kind of who comes out on top, or, looking at it the other way, who loses and whose territory will be easiest to pick up. There certainly have been reports of skirmishes between the various groups where it appears that CJNG might be trying to take over some areas that had been dominated by Los Chapitos in the past. But those have been scattered and not anything that appears to be a systematic war plan, if you will. All right, who are the biggest losers? Well, the biggest losers by far, are the people of Culiacan. And surrounding areas. And you have to feel for them. You have to feel for the businesses, for the students, for the families who've lost people, either people who have disappeared or the deaths that have occurred. The second biggest loser, though, has to be Yvonne. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Yvonne planned, or at least had knowledge of, Joaquin's betrayal of El Mayo. If he was behind it, or knew about it and endorsed it, he had to have thought that 6 months down the road, 9 months down the road, his power in CDS would be a hell of a lot different than it is today. Instead, he's twice escaped by running through tunnels. He's gone from being, the master strategist to another cartel leader trying to hang on while the government continues its relentless pursuit. And would it shock anyone listening if tomorrow or Saturday or next week you heard that Ivan had been captured? The answer to that has to be no. Nobody would be shocked. So while, before Mayo was extradited or renditioned into the United States, there were disputes, right? Chapitos and Mayiza weren't getting along. The Chapitos, no longer had a great relationship with El Mayo, who was the godfather to at least one of them. But they weren't at war. So if Ivan was behind it, or let's even say if he was endorsing it, he took a big swing, and that swing could have resulted in a home run. But right now, it looks like he's still standing at home because his swing was a swing and a miss. Okay, that's my thoughts on this. And as I say, part of the reason that I wanted to go through this is I don't think we've thought about CDS, or we certainly haven't talked about CDS in this global way before and thought about it in terms of the different groups. We didn't really spend much time talking about El Guano, and all reports seem to be that he has far less influence now than he ever has before. And so you really, when if you talk about that DEA National Threat Assessment, it says there's an umbrella group or umbrella organization with those four groups. It really does seem now that it's the two groups. It's Mayiza and Chapitos. So let's look for that going forward. Next week, as a preview, I want to talk about the civil case involving Caro Quintero and the Camarena family. I'm not sure if we'll do it this week, but I hope to have the one of the lawyers on that case on a podcast to talk about it. But I want to go through it and I want to talk about it. Last week, I promised you a rant about my former DEA friend, and that should be with air quotes and a heavy dose of sarcasm. I'm going to save that until next week, and I'll explain why when we talk about it next week. And then the last thing is I do want to mention, I hate self-promotion, but my second book is out. Someone Had to Lie. Talks a lot about the U.S. government's involvement in drug trafficking in Mexico for many, many years. Goes back and talks about some of the things that Gary Webb had looked for. It's annotated. There's footnotes. There's a bibliography. Some people have said some very nice things, that the story is fun and fast-paced, but there's a lot of good quality nonfiction content within it. It'd be an honor if you'd buy the book and read it. If you like it, leave a review. If you like it, let me know. You can also go to llewellynwriting.com and pick it up off of that, and I'll send you a signed copy. So Someone Had to Lie, Amazon, all those places, or llewellynwriting.com. That'll do it for today. I will see you next week on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena, and I wish you a great week.